Let's go.
All right. Hey, everybody. This is Oliver Bruce from the Micromobility podcast and now show. I have with us today, Joseph Brennan. How are you doing, Joseph?
Doing well. Yeah, doing well.
Excellent. Well, look, I'm really excited to have you on. I've been following your work probably for about a year or so, and I've been really excited to kind of learn a bit more about it as when it first came up, mainly because I think the idea of software kind of enabled operations and analytics is so, well, when I was at Uber, I picked up so much of like understanding why that was so powerful. And it's been really exciting to see that getting applied to the micromobility space. And I think the way that you're dealing with it's really interesting. So maybe what we could do is start for the audience kind of right back at the beginning, like what's your background? Where did you come from? And then we can kind of work through into how you started Zoba.
Yeah, for sure. The Uber background on this topic is interesting. I feel like Uber in a lot of ways kind of got everyone thinking about these problems. And so for us, oftentimes that's the first thing people go to because they really, I think, made these sort of cool problems, these geospatial analytics issues. So I guess kind of top line for Zoba, for anyone that doesn't know, before I kick into the background, we are a micromobility primarily optimization platform. So we are optimizing operations. And so what this tends to look like is vehicle placement, task automation. So think like you've got swaps, pickups, drops, all these different things. We're kind of creating logic behind that to automate some of those decisions. And then additionally, we're getting into the dynamic pricing game in a pretty big way here as well, which is where we think a lot of this is going eventually. As far as kind of my pathway into micromobility, it was definitely a bit of like stumbling into it. So I started Zoba with my brother Daniel in 2016. We were both grad students at the time. He was in Boston, I was in Beijing. He had the original idea. So Daniel was kind of fresh out of the military and been amazed by all of the sorts of geospatial tech they were using there. And so he had this sort of idea that we could start a company that was trying to sort of elevate the geospatial analytics space in a pretty horizontal way. So this was like pre-Kepler on the Uber topic. This was pre-Kepler and a lot of the sort of open source innovation that's been happening at Uber. And we felt like in general, people were just, not taking advantage of all the data that they were building, mostly from smartphones, but generally in an interesting way. So initially kind of the path into micro, so we were working on these, this spatial analytics platform generally, and we're having conversations in a lot of spaces, and then just felt this immediate pull from any of the micromobility operators we talked to. This was super early. So these were like people operating, more kind of municipal bike shares and stuff like this. This was 2017. So just when, just kind of early on, even before Bird was really becoming super popular. Around the same time, we met up with a guy who leads our data science team, Evan Fields, who was finishing a PhD at MIT, focused entirely on kind of novel demand forecasting techniques for mobility systems that have hard assets. So not like two-sided marketplaces, but micro or car share or whatever. And so kind of the combination of timing, we were already working on spatial analytics and meeting some key people at the right time, it all just kind of converged. And so we dug into the micro space, went pretty vertical there, and have been doing that for a few years now. And it's been tons of fun, cool to grow up with the space. Never expected to like work on urban tech. I grew up, my brother and I grew up in like really small town Texas. So it's kind of fun now playing this role in city life.
Totally. And so talk us the geospatial thing, like for someone who doesn't have any reference point, like when you talk about this, like what do you do? If you're coming at this from like, I don't really understand what you're talking about. All of this stuff is pretty complex to me. What does that look like?
Yeah, so actually this is a really interesting question. So I think the way I would answer this now is pretty different than the way I would answer this previously. So I would say what Zoba does now is we automate a lot of sort of operational interventions, but they're all operational interventions that are really kind of time and space sensitive. So we're deciding like, hey, you've got 1,000 vehicles. This is the 10% you should be doing a price intervention, or you're placing 50 of them out in the market. Here's where they should go. And so it's not, when you think geospatial, spatial, you think like maps, like map making, and there are certainly maps involved. But the real core thing is sort of decision automation as it relates to very dynamic questions in space and time. So I'd say it's really more about kind of very concrete things. We place the vehicle there, not there. We price the vehicle differently on that corner versus that corner.
And is it so? Yeah. Oh, wow. I'm really excited about the pricing thing, mainly because we can come back to that though. But yeah. Is it just for placement? So, say for example, you're working with a company. Let's give them a name that is 4 letters and starts maybe with some letter like a T or an L or a whatever.
Yeah.
The kind of when you go and start working with them, is it around just placement of the vehicle in the beginning of the day? Is it because, I mean, once a vehicle is kind of started moving, like, are you starting to intervene at multiple stages throughout the day in terms of moving a scooter or an e-bike around on a shared system? Or is it mainly just the, like, where it gets placed in the morning?
It depends. I mean, so if it's a swap, so I think, and we can get into this later, but there is a big conversation. There has been this sort of quiet ground shift in terms of how operations are happening in micro. So if it is a non-swappable fleet, so kind of the first iteration, those things, the life, kind of the charge cycle, so to speak, on non-swappable fleets is very basic, right? The vehicle, you go get the 10 or 20% of the vehicles that are dead, maybe more if you're getting very high utilization. You take them back to your warehouse, you charge them, you place them out at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. or whatever. In a swappable context, this is like dramatically more complex. And so there's no kind of natural get all the vehicles at night, move them. These things are happening throughout the course of the day, and there are many more kind of decision factors going on. So you are rebalancing vehicles, you are having to decide how many to rebalance, should you rebalance any? We don't have to move them anymore because we're not taking them back to the warehouse, they're just on the street. We're swapping batteries, we're doing point maintenance, we might have to pick some up. And these things are happening much more dynamically all day long. So I would say if it is a swappable fleet, this is an all-day thing, and it's not just about this vehicle is poorly allocated, this one's well allocated. It's kind of the entire operations logic. So should I be swapping en route? Should I not be? Do I have kind of like regulatory issues I have to solve en route to my rebalances? And it gets really complex and like a much more challenging problem. For non-swappables, it's pretty much what you said. Like, morning they go out, you don't touch them the rest of the day.
Totally. Okay, so I know you've got some beautiful images and things like that, and I was just wondering, can you pull those up? Because let's talk about it.
Now, and I guess before I show this, one thing I want to provide context on, kind of like someone's new to spatial analytics, how to think about it. The first generation of spatial analytics, like a lot of analytics, was I think mostly to inform. So you imagine like ArcGIS or whatever, Kepler, you're pulling up data, you're looking at it, you're being like, I get rides over there, I get rides over here, whatever you're looking at. The way Zoba approaches this is much more like, if you use your Uber example, we're like a back-end decision-making process that relates to spatial problems. So when you open the Uber app, and they serve you a price, and they serve you an ETA, there is a tremendous amount of complex data processing and data analytics happening behind the scenes to serve you that. And a lot of it relates to space and time, but like it's not just showing you a map. It's getting to that final decision. And so I think Zoba's more kind of on that end of the spectrum is kind of how to think about it. But in terms of what this looks like, so like if you think about like an average fleet, the way I usually like to describe this is, I'll show you a couple of things quickly. So if you imagine like a micro fleet that's moving, there's a lot of really interesting sort of unique supply dynamics with micromobility that aren't the same with like an Uber or lots of systems. And so one of those is that the users create the supply network primarily, right? So if we have a 1,000 vehicle fleet and we were balancing like 10, 20% of the fleet on any given day, but the users are doing 2 rides per vehicle per day, the users are an order of magnitude more frequently creating the supply network. They're choosing where the vehicles are left and what vehicles will be available to the next cohort of users. Does that make sense? Like they're really creating the system, and Zoba is just operating within the system they create. And so just kind of show you what this looks like, this little kind of circulation visual, these areas in blue are on net attractors of vehicles. So vehicles flow in there more frequently than they leave. Areas in red are the exact opposite. They're leaving more frequently than they show up. And so what you see is in most markets, this is pre-COVID, COVID data looks very different just because there's less circulation because there's fewer commuters. But if we look pre-COVID, you got people flow into downtown Austin in the morning, and then here in the afternoon, they flow back out, right? And you have some nice circulation, but anywhere you look in the market, there are asymmetries. So if we look here in, near Zilker Park, people are dropping vehicles on net here both in the morning and in the afternoon. Over the course of the day, supply starts to accumulate here. There's less supply available in the whole network. And as a result, the network as a system really suffers, and the unit economics suffer, everything drags. And so the way the Zoba system works is basically we're trying to understand not just like the next set of user behaviors, but how the whole system will evolve over the course of a day. So just to give you an example in Austin again, so this visual is demand evolution throughout sort of a generic day in Austin. So where do we expect user?
Yeah. So when it's going up, what does that mean? Does that mean that there's demand there, or that there's new supply that's been deposited there?
Yeah. Just to clarify. So the higher levels, so the higher heights are higher demand. And when we say demand at Zoba, like we actually mean demand. We mean where users want rides. Not trip starts, not app opens. This is a Zoba generated proxy for demand, and we're trying to measure it as best we can. And it's a lot of like what makes our system special is that we're quite good at that. So this is measured in rides wanted per hour. It's unitful. So we're looking at kind of how demand is flowing throughout Austin throughout the course of the day. This is sensitive to weather and all the different things that might be going on in the market. And this is like one of the core building blocks here. The other core building block is understanding. I mentioned that supply, that supply factor earlier, where the users are dropping the vehicles where they want to end their trip, right? The users don't care about how well positioned your fleet is. It's not material to them. What this looks like is for any given point, you want to understand what the kind of probability distribution is of places that the users will drop the vehicle. So if we just look at University of Texas here, this is for a weekday morning. University of Texas, big university, tens of thousands of students. The thickness of the line here is suggesting the relative probability that a vehicle will be taken to some destination given a trip start. So if the trip starts where I have my cursor, where is it likely to go? It's most likely to go, as we can see, somewhere else in the University of Texas. The students are taking it to, another part of campus, and then infrequently south towards downtown. And then if those users take it, let's say just west here, then we can say, okay, so then if the vehicle ends up west, where is it likely going to go next? And if you have these pieces together with the demand, you can basically model how the market will evolve over the whole day, and then make whatever limited interventions you're making in such a way that they have sort of, asymmetrically high impact on the market. And another way to think about it is sort of like chaining together rides, or placing vehicles such that they flow downstream to demand. And then what this looks like in a very concrete way, it's pretty simple, right? So in a rebalancing context, it's like for a swappable fleet, you're just saying, pick up this vehicle ID and reallocate it to one of these points. I had mentioned earlier that we've got a bit more full stack in terms of task unification. Today, in practice, what this looks like is, this is kind of 3 different van loads of about 50 vehicles each. And we're just saying, look, you're going to start with this van, and these are all the stops you're going to go through. In a non-swappable context, that would just be like drops of vehicles. The van's full of vehicles from the warehouse we're dropping. In a swappable context, like I said, that could be pick up a vehicle, drop a different charged vehicle, swap a battery, 311, there's a lot more en route that might be changing. But ultimately what we're trying to generate are these sort of task lists that go out to an operator, and then they implement this. And if everything's working right, it should really change the downstream kind of readiness of the fleet to meet whatever demand where it is.
Totally. Oh, dude, this is fascinating. So, I mean, like that level of routing. I mean, I just remember talking to some of the early operators in the scooter game, right? And I think the early days, it was like, we know where the scooter is. We think there's demand here. We can pull some of the basic analytics of knowing that if someone's tried to open the scooter app to see if there was availability, there wasn't, so they've gone. And just, I can see the granularity of, like you're getting now to the point where you route it and just be like, look, drops these scooters off in these places. I take it all of that is done. Those calculations are largely done. How do I put it? You're getting to the point where the entire you're optimizing for revenue, right? So you're looking for ways to drop the scooter to somewhere that the probability is high that someone's going to go take a trip. But we haven't.
And then someone will take a trip after and after and after.
Totally.
Yeah.
The thing is, at the moment, we haven't really even talked about pricing, and like at the moment, I mean, I certainly don't know of anybody who's done integrated planning and is looking at demand, like price responsive. Like there's no scooter app that I've opened where I've said, I want to go from here to here. And then they've said, cool, walk to this scooter. And this scooter is going to cost you, $3 for that trip or $1 for that trip because you're actually taking it to a place that we want you to go to. They talked about, like, I remember interviewing, actually, no, it wasn't when I did the interview with Japetsky, but like Ryan from Jump was interviewed by Jason Calacanis, and he was talking at the time that they had done incentive programs for people riding into demand areas. And that was about the only thing that I've ever seen. Like, if you look at still, we haven't really seen any of the operators actually get fully integrated yet. And, where's that going? Like, is that a thing? I mean, I assume price responsive demand is just going to be the next big win, right?
Yeah, so I think dynamic pricing is definitely on the horizon. I think we're going to see more and more of this. So one last thing on the routing. The other thing with routing I think is challenging is there's enough different about the micromobility use case that kind of frustrates a lot of current routing engines. So just like battery levels, there are certain heuristics that are relevant to the micro space where, if you need to know what the battery level is for a certain kind of threshold to pick up en route, that's hard for most systems built for parcels and the like. On the pricing piece, so if I could show you something else quickly, like so I'm pretty excited about this. I think this is going to be a big way the space moves. Right now, like you're saying, there's very little dynamic pricing work being done, even though it's so commonplace in a lot of other kind of adjacent spaces. And in addition to that, where you do see dynamic pricing, you can't see this as the user, but like on the back end, what's typically happening is there's either like a time threshold. So vehicle's been idle for 2 days, and at that point, it's already a huge problem. But then it gets a price intervention. Or the other thing that's happening is there's kind of static geofences. So if I drop in this specific area, it doesn't change, I get an incentive. So it's not actually really dynamic in any sort of meaningful way. It's just kind of, altering the user experience a bit. We think that the main blockers for this is it's just a really hard problem in micro because you have to be right like many hours in advance. And so if you think about like Uber has price responsive supply. If they need more drivers on the road, they can get more drivers on the road. They're doing a matching problem where, they raise your price a little bit, they raise the driver's price a little bit or pay out a little bit. And there's this nice matching problem and the supply moves. You can get the driver wherever you want to get the driver. With micro, like the user's not telling you where they're going. They're not telling you how long the trip's going to be. You have to kind of anticipate a lot about the user that in other systems they would just signal with their search or whatever. The way we've approached this is, and the main thing they're missing is if you can't accurately model the demand over many hours, you can't do anything, right? There's so many kind of missing factors from what the user's telling you. We're using a lot of the same tech that I showed you earlier. So like understanding how the demand's going to evolve, understanding what those chains of rides are going to be to basically use the user incentives to sort of, it's almost like user rebalancing, right? So we flag say 5 or 10% of the fleet for a user, price decrease on trip start. We don't have to make it like drop off constraint. We don't have to say like you have to drop the vehicle here, which is fairly user hostile because we know the probability distribution of where the users will likely go. Like if I'm pretty certain you're going to take the vehicle to downtown from where you are, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that beneficial for me to require you to go downtown. I just have to continue to model that and do my best at kind of estimating the probabilities.
Totally. There's that when you say that there are just so many variables that you can't know about a customer, it just really drives that home to me of I think about it as like, you're right. I've been walking into town and past a scooter and the scooter's in a terrible place. And you kind of go like, you should be paying me to ride this into the demand area.
Especially with mopeds. Where it costs so much to move. Like with kick scooters, it's, the rebalancing can be challenging, but I mean, like more and more operators are getting into mopeds. With mopeds, they should definitely be paying you to move, especially just because it's so costly to move them.
Totally. And yet it's very, very hard to be able to surface that intent from me and also I wouldn't necessarily, it's like I've decided to walk into town. So I'm going past and I'm not in another transport mode. Yeah. And I'm like, but I would only make that decision if I then didn't need it, pretty much, right? Like I'm not going to go and say, oh, I want to get into town. So it's this weird thing of like, how do you surface that demand? And then I think that's where like the kind of the idea of an overall marketplace for mobility comes in. And this is, I just love to hear your thoughts on, like the idea of an infrastructure and kind of going back in history a little bit, like that's what I worked on a little bit when I was at Uber, was this idea of, what would happen if we looked at it as a strategic threat, which was what happens if Lyft combined all of their supply with all the taxis and with every other player in the world, right? That there was one person who said, I want to ride, and then everybody could bid for that ride. That there was like an open marketplace for this. And I can see that that's maybe going to come. You couldn't do it on an existing infrastructure at the moment, but you might see it coming along with like some of the open marketplaces that have been built on crypto and that sort of stuff. So, and that there would be an open marketplace for supply and an open marketplace for demand, and that those would start getting met. And so you would be able to see, for example, surface the ride that's saying I'm going from here to here, and it can be serviced by a bus, or it can be serviced by a train, or it can be serviced by a taxi, or it can be serviced by a car or whatever. And that's how we actually start getting kind of more open, flexible marketplaces. But that's 5-10 years down the line. There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen. Like, can you what do you think would be the steps that you'd take or that will be taken to be able to get us to that sort of world?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like I think Zoba ends up so dialed in on kind of where the operations are today. I mean, the signals we see. So I guess one thing is, I think you're going to see cities probably get smarter with how they're kind of wielding their power in terms of like some of these very, very kind of rudimentary regulations where they just tax you really intensely. I think over time that's
going to pass the threshold. You mean?
Well, so I think eventually, like, or just saying on a per vehicle basis what you're going to pay the city. I think it's going to be like, look, if you're in these zones, these demand zones, or whatever else, like this is the price ascribed to these. In terms of a more unified system, I think one big shift that people underappreciate is with micromobility and also with AVs. Micromobility looks a lot more like AVs in some ways than you would think. And the reason why is that you own the supply, or the supply is fixed. And so Uber, like these Uber models or DoorDash or whatever, they're two-sided marketplaces. The operator doesn't pay for the trip unless the trip is matched, and then they pay out to the driver, they take a cut. And the price is an incentive for the supply, so you can get more supply on the street. With micro as well as like AVs, it's going to be interesting because you've got some fixed amount of supply in the near term for the city, and then like to your point, you're trying to figure out across all these things, buses, AVs, microtransit, micromobility, whatever it is, like how to best service this whole like ecosystem of demand with an amount of supply that's relatively locked in the near term. It's a very challenging problem. And so some sort of like cross-functional communication there, I think could definitely work out. I mean, I don't, you would know better than I kind of what that might evolve to look like, but. It's
like MDS and GBFS, but then like on steroids, with pricing and the ability to do dynamic pricing and all that sort of stuff. Totally. Yeah, I think that's conceptually that's what MDS is, right? Like that's why LA DOT came up with it and then subsequently put it into the OMF. But it was just OMF is the Open Mobility Foundation. I should stop the acronyms. But yeah, this idea of mobility data specifications is because LA could see that there was a future coming where there were going to be autonomous vehicles on the road and that they wanted to be able to do real-time pricing for them. And you need to know where the vehicle is, and you need to know how to price it, and you need to know how to do all that sort of stuff. And I can see a world in which we start doing real-time pricing for our cars on our roads. And that actually, that is like the biggest thing. If governments were really serious about trying to solve congestion, they would actually they would pursue that as a mechanism rather than trying to build more infrastructure. Because I think it just comes down to like, we have mispriced all of our street space allocation. But
100%. Yeah.
That's a whole nother discussion for another day. I do want to dig in a little bit. So in terms of the tech that you see that's coming down the pipe from operators, right? So you talked about swappable batteries. Clear, is that a sort of, I take it's not a silver bullet, but what are the sort of operational efficiencies that you can see getting unlocked by operators here?
Yeah, so obviously I have a pretty Zoba forward take here. I mean, I think when you think about micromobility and kind of the evolution, there is rightfully so a tremendous amount of focus on hardware. So everyone's been thinking about the hardware and these kind of like these iteration loops, and you guys have done a ton of great work on this, and that makes sense. It is probably the biggest thing to change the unit economics and make the businesses work. I think that people, just because they can't see it, underestimate how far we are on the operation side of this. And so the way you were describing, operators earlier in terms of like it being a very like, intuition-driven, challenging process, which is super inefficient, that's still mostly how it works. Or if it doesn't work that way, it's very early innings. I think people don't realize that. But these problems are very, we're solving them. They're hard to solve. You're dealing with kind of real world hardware, very fast changing markets. Whether or not it's raining completely changes the dynamic in the whole market. Like they're really challenging issues. But I think there is a tremendous amount there. So like on Zoba's side, it's not uncommon for us to launch in markets and see 30, 40, 50, 60% increases as reasonable on ridership, which, similar to the scooter lasting 2, 3, 4 times as long, it changes the fundamentals of the business. And so we're seeing more and more of that.
I just want to stress this. You are seeing 50 to 60% improvements in some markets. In other words, you're really changing it from it's a business that kind of makes money to a business that actually makes money.
Yes, yeah. And that's just on the gains in terms of ridership. And then you think about like consolidating these tasks. So what you have if you don't have this task consolidation, and it's a real like, micromobility nerdy topic, but for this audience, they might enjoy it. Like if you're not doing this, what you end up having is people like crisscrossing the city all day. So there's a battery swap, and then there's like a pickup, and there's a drop off, and they're driving, the miles they're driving are insane. Whereas if they were just if it was planned or done in a way where you could trade off between all these decision factors, which you can't do with intuition well, you can consolidate so much of this down and just really get a lot more out of each labor hour. So like that kind of improvement on the OpEx side of the business, 30, 40, 50% increases in per asset ridership being feasible. I think that like on the operation side, that the changes that are possible are as dramatic as on the hardware side. I just think most operators haven't been at that level of the business yet. So like the first thing you do when you start a micromobility company is like get scooters on the road, and like the scooters break and the users throw them in the river, and it's like really challenging, and and you're losing scooters, and you do that for a while, and then you get to a point where you start like tuning. And I think it's, we're early on in this industry, and the tuning and the operators that are like doing tuning really well, it is not a lot. And so it's early is what I'm trying to say. I think people don't appreciate that. No one's using the first generation of scooters anymore. Like that lasted 2-3 weeks. That is gone. No one does that anymore. A lot of operators are still operating the similar way than they were early. I think that the big inflection point is anyone who tries to transition to swappables with that model gets nailed. It's really hard.
Really interesting. Okay. So if we're just talking logistics, so how does it work for people, for companies? I'm going to do your sales pitch for you here. So for companies that are looking to bring Zoba online, how does that work? I mean, how do are there sort of dynamics to like people? So how much access to data can you get, and or do you need to be able to make it make sense? And then like is it? Because I take it everybody's running kind of slightly different systems and stuff.
Yeah. So the basic way it works is we're kind of building this optimization platform that needs to feed on data to learn about kind of where there are gaps, how the operations run. The way this works, like if you like Oliver Scooter Co. wanna kind of test this out, we would run this in simulation first. So you'd feed us your data, like a cut of it historically. We'd look in simulation and say, look, you guys are underperforming your potential by 40, 50%. We can actually do this before going live. And we don't enter engagements where there aren't meaningful gains. It's not worth it for Zoba. And so we look at that, we say, okay, that looks great. And we then start, generating whatever your kind of operational cadence is. You say, I move the vehicles 5 times a day or whatever. We start generating those task lists for that. We are an API kind of first company, so this is usually integrating into some other existing part of your stack, and you start to execute on these tasks. We start to measure the impact of those interventions, and that's basically how it works. And on the data side, most of the data we use relates to trip histories and vehicle histories. So we want to know where the vehicle's been at all times, when it's been available, when it's been under maintenance. We can actually get just about all of this from MDS. So MDS wasn't designed for this purpose. However, Zoba can get an MDS token and get most of what we need there. I will say with MDS, one issue you run into, which I think is also maybe surprising, is there's a lot of inconsistency in how MDS is implemented. And so mobility data specification for anyone who's not tracking the kind of data part of this. And so you end up sometimes having like the actual IoT is fine. It's just like this was mapped wrong internally or something. So that can be an issue, but generally that's how it works. And let's say like a month of data, it depends on the market, right? Depends on how many rides you have and what geometry, but yeah.
And then the pricing for you works as do you do it on a kind of a fixed rate, or how does that work?
Typically by vehicle coverage. And so, the way we typically do it is we look in simulation, we say how it is, we test during a pilot, not always, often, and then we start to go from there. And if you're in very many markets, let's say you have like, like 30,000 vehicles or something, maybe we cover 8,000 initially and then you ramp over time. I will say that Zoba tends to be more relevant later in a company's life cycle. Like if you're very early, you have to be pretty good at operations to really get the most out of like a very intense, decision automation engine. Like if you're just trying to like get the basics down, it's just challenging, and like that took us some time to realize. And so, but if you can execute on this, and we monitor kind of like how well these tasks are being executed, like the combination of the hardware and I think the amount of I don't want to call it low-hanging fruit because it's hard, but gains in ops that are possible. Like I think, from our vantage point, these businesses are going to be very strong, and I think people discount the hardware side. They discount the ops side and only focus on hardware.
Yeah, no, totally. Having spent a bit of time, I had a conversation with Alan from Beam a little while back, and his big thing was, he's ex Uber and then Mobike, Ofo, and his whole point was like, this is an ops game. Like that's where we've found the most value. It's like we didn't even bother trying to do our own custom hardware. Just went like standard agnostic stuff. We don't really care. It's the ops is where we win and lose, and they've done very well. They've got amazing like growing coverage across. They're the largest micromobility operator in Asia Pacific.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool. So the business itself, you started in 2016. This has obviously been a boom and bust kind of sector. And like we've seen billions of dollars poured into scooter operators.
Yeah.
How has it been for you as a business to grow through that? And like, did you kind of go through the boom bust yourselves? And then what's it been like for fundraising and things like that?
Yeah, so on the boom and bust, so last year was obviously hard for anyone exposed to this space. I think that for Zoba, because we're a pretty deep tech company and we're not like bearing the brunt of these operations, which are so expensive, it was easier for us. So we actually grew in headcount and retained everyone. So for us, 2020 was a heavy development year, and I think we'll be better for it in 2021. But we were fortunate to keep everyone and grow. In terms of like the boom and bust of what we're seeing, we also get quite a bit of visibility into the data, obviously, on what's happening in ridership, and that has us pretty optimistic. And so what we're seeing now, depending on the region, it's different in different regions, but we're seeing let's think like last year, kind of coming to what should be peak season. What we were seeing, even though the lockdowns are pretty intense in a lot of places, is while like public transit, for example, might be off 20, 30, 40% from where the ridership should be, micromobility in a lot of the markets we're seeing, or most of them, would be up a bit or only off very slightly, but basically where you'd expect it to be. And so what that tells us as a business is like this year is, as people start to move around, and we've obviously been hugely influenced by you guys and kind of this market for miles, the market for miles got very small, right? Like people just aren't moving. But like the modal share in that market, from what we've seen, was clearly, healthy or growing. Yeah. As the market per mile starts to expand, like we're very confident this year. And then on the fundraising side, fundraising's hard. It's always hard. I think Zoba as a company, we feel pretty fortunate. So we're backed by some of the best VCs out there, including CRV, which is an early backer in DoorDash and Uber. DoorDash and Bird, and a bunch of generational companies. Founder Collective, Mark Cuban was involved since the very beginning. Aaron Slidkraut, who's a former head of data at Uber. Anthony Goldblum, founder and CEO of Kaggle. So just a really great crop of investors who are helping us build Zoba into, we're really trying to build a category. And in terms of like the general environment now, when micromobility picks up, I think for companies raising in the space, it's going to pick up. But it's a good time to be like a remote work startup. It's not a great time to be a transportation startup, but things will pick up.
Totally. I mean, I think the thing that's interesting for me about what you guys have done is been, you've taken the analytic intelligence aspect and just really honed down on that, and then worked out a way to monetize that aspect to it. And I think, one of the things that we've talked about in the micromobility world is that it's an innovation, not an invention, and that over time this whole sector is going to modularize. That there's that you'll see people like the shared operators. Actually, shared operations make most sense as a franchise. That you bring in the intelligence, kind of cobbled together, and you do a McDonald's equivalent, and someone buys the franchise and runs it in a city, and that's a business. And you can see it sort of happening with like the Bird platform and others. That hasn't actually played out so far. We thought that was going to be the case in terms of how the market would move. But I do think that over time, like there's no way that one large company can own and have assets on every corner in every city and everywhere, like all over the world. That's just not the way that it's going to play. So this idea that you'll end up with like lots and lots and lots of players, and then how do we build and ensure that the operational efficiencies that are maybe unlocked in Bogota, Colombia, can actually get shared across to somebody who's operating in some other places, right? And I think that's where a company like yours is really interesting, because it allows those learnings to filter up and then to filter down, and then actually the overall industry itself learns and grows faster. So I'm excited. I'm really. It's an amazing, in some ways, an amazing time to be building this sort of companies, because we wouldn't have been able to build this even 5 years ago when we were doing Uber and Lyft, because there just wouldn't have been anybody to buy your products, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's the way the world's going. I mean, like if you think about Zoba, and I guess this gets back to the fundraising, and like when you think about what a very big Zoba looks like down the road, these kinds of problems Zoba is solving are pretty hard and pretty specific. And so will you have some, large companies, even think like, I think micromobility companies, even think bigger. So like maybe like a food delivery or an Uber type companies at that scale, you will have good capabilities. And like what Uber has done is amazing. The economy is generally becoming more urban and more on demand generally. I think that these are some of the more fundamental problems and some of the harder problems. It's really hard to do, Zoba is a super specialized firm. This is all we do. We pour all of our resources into it. We have, engineering resources just building like simulation tooling to just test certain parts of our system. The kind of focus you get as a startup like ours on this problem, it's hard to match, even with a lot of resources, is what we've seen. And so, yeah, we're excited. We think that our hope is that we can kind of enable this transition in much the same way that like it would be hard to build a lot of companies today without the modern, kind of API-centric tech stack. You'd have to do so much core. And so we're thinking that we'll play a lot of the same role for sharing. And I mean, as far as how the market plays out, like, again, I think this is a topic where I wouldn't dare kind of throw my opinion in the ring here, as I think you're much sharper on the topic, but like there's a lot of incredible entrepreneurs building companies. And I think however in the micromobility space, however they end up evolving, I think whatever kind of iteration it is, we'll be able to serve it, which is exciting.
Yeah. Wicked. Well, look, man, I'm conscious we're up against time. So I just want to say thank you for this. This has been so super interesting. And I'm sure that the audience themselves will really appreciate it and be able to follow up. Because we're on YouTube, we'll be able to follow off with a bunch of links. But is there any, for folks who do want to track you down, the easiest way to do that would be, are you on Twitter? Are you...
Yeah, I'm not a big Twitter person, unfortunately. I feel like this is maybe holding me back, but you can find us at zoba.com, and it's easy to get in touch there. Yeah.
Yeah, wicked, cool.
LinkedIn is good for me, but Twitter I'm behind.
Okay, yeah, awesome.
Yeah,
All right. Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much, Joseph. Really appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you.